Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Gale, Senior Director of Investor Relations here at the Allegheny Conference. Welcome to the latest installment of the conference's Response and Recovery webinar series. Before we dive into our programming, I want to thank our sponsors for their generous support that makes all of this possible. Our thanks to Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark, and UPMC Health Plan. I'd also like to thank the members of the Allegheny Conference's Regional Investors Council for their time, talent, and resources in support of the conference's work on behalf of the region, including Accenture, a global leading professional services company with operations here in Pittsburgh, with members of its team as presenters here today. Today's webinar is grounded in a reality that's no surprise to all of us, that reopening for business does not mean a return to the way things used to be prior to the pandemic. What's ahead of us is marked by uncertainty on many levels, as well as market conditions that are unpredictable at best. Today, we're not going to hear about what's holding us back, but rather what can move us forward. Reinvention as a means to outmaneuvering uncertainty. During the course of this webinar, Accenture will explore the opportunities for companies to strengthen their capabilities for transformation and long-term resilience, leveraging the power of automation, data, security, technology, and more to come out of this better and stronger for the future. Following Accenture's presentation, we'll head into the Q&A portion of the webinar that my colleague Patrice Thompson, Director of Investor Relations here at the conference, will be moderating. During the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function below. There's a lot to be unpacked on this program and this most important topic. So I'm going to turn the program over to Taufik Jarjour, Senior Manager at Accenture Strategy, to get things started. Taufik?
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and it's wonderful to be with you here today. I know it's virtual, but I always love spending time with people from Pittsburgh. I'm actually initially from Pittsburgh, and it's always good to connect with all of you from Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. So today, I'm really excited to introduce this topic. It's something that's near and dear to me, to Paul, to others at the company. I've had a unique role recently, and Paul has too, where we've helped a lot of companies around the country and been able to present at many cities to talk about the importance of the decisions that companies are facing right now in terms of how to reinvent their business around the challenges that everyone's facing today. And what we've found is that in the midst of everything that's going there's a lot of struggle that we have in terms of determining exactly what to do and how we're going to course correct. So today we're going to talk about a mix of what kind of course correction needs to happen as the facts keep changing on the ground and the challenges keep shifting every few weeks. And then at the same time, how can you reinvent your business for a new future? Because what we're going to in the future is not going to be the same as where we came from. So with that being said, I really am excited to introduce you to Paul, and then I'll be around after Paul presents, so we're going to have a really cool Q&A. So in the meantime, I'm excited to get your questions, whatever it is that you're struggling with, and see if we can help you out a little bit. So with that being said, I'd love to introduce you to Paul Nunez, who is in charge of our thought leadership and just really a brilliant practitioner. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Taufik. Hello and good morning to everyone, and thank you for having us. As Taufik says, we know what we're here to talk about, but as a 34-year employee of Accenture, and I know that's a scary thought, some call me a lifer, but I hope there's a lot more life in me. But I have not seen, and I think like many of you, we just have not seen anything like this in business in our history and in our experience. And I've spent a lot of that looking at future forecasting, technology visioning, and business visioning. And this really is unprecedented. Yet it's something that we have to live through, something that we're going to have to deal with and to make the best of and try and do our best. So we've been doing a lot of research in my organization and in the part of it that I work particularly in, Accenture Research, to try and understand the situation, understand the differences between now and other past downturns. We think there's some substantial ones, but also to try and figure out what are some of the right moves, some of the better moves that we can do going into the future. and how those can be informed by some of what we're seeing across the patch, as they say. So what I'd like to do today really is just share with you some of the findings of that research, engage you in a conversation to the extent possible. We're all exploring this new technology of sort of virtual meeting. And you'll see in a moment that we're going to try and explore some new audience sentiment measuring with a tool called Menti. So we're going to try a little of that and a little real-time research if possible. And hopefully just to try and have a good conversation. So I'm only going to speak for a portion of the call, about 20-25 minutes. And then we're going to go to a Q&A, and I'd encourage all of you to participate actively in that. If you'd like to participate or ask questions in the meantime, please do so as well, even if you just want to get it in there because you're thinking of it at the moment, and then the moderators will try and figure out how best to organize those questioning. So on the next slide, why don't we start off with, let's go to the next slide, please. Let's start off with a Menti question just to see if we can get that to work for everyone. So if you go to menti.com and put in the code, the first question you're going to find is, what industry do you work in? And why don't we just get a sense, and we'll see why that's important in a few minutes, but a sense of what industry the folks on the call are working in. So the code is 270924. And for those of you that might be unfamiliar with Menti, what you're seeing is the number of responses become larger on this chart. So so far we have a lot of consulting folks. Let's see if we can get some other folks kind of in there. Nonprofit, civil, healthcare, construction, business, technology, economic development. That's good. Engineering and construction, higher education, well, so that gives us a sense of who's on the call and the kind of areas and questions. Now we're going to see in a couple of moments why that's so important, but I'll give you the sneak preview. We think that the impacts, it's very clear that the impacts and therefore the strategies for coming out of COVID are very different across the different industries. So while we're going to talk today about some hopefully general insights and some general plans, we think it's really important to understand that everything even that I'm going to say today is going to have to be tailored to your particular industry. And maybe we'll have some specific questions about that. So I'll leave that one more second so people can see, because we're continuing to get some more answers. State government, education, business, human resources, and architectural, another important function. So for the next slide, let's ask one more question. And this one is really important because this came up as we started to do our research. In truth, what the question was, how are we going to get back to business, back to work? Back to work was a topic that was pretty big early on, just after the start of COVID. But one of the big questions really is, are we going back to work, or are we actually going to a new form of work? Are we going back to a new normal and a permanently changed way of working? So what I'd ask of the audience is just wondering, are you hoping to go back to a normal state of work, or are you hoping to conduct work in a different way, in a more permanently different way going forward? Okay, I think that just about sums it up. We get a pretty good sense here of where the numbers are leading us. What we're seeing is that clearly an awful lot of us don't expect our businesses to go back to a normal state of work. Now, for those that are, there may be some industry factors and features that go along with that, but clearly, and that's very consistent with what we saw in our research and something that we actually were a little surprised about early on. Every company that we talked to in the early research said they didn't expect to go back to the way things were. They recognized that they needed to be different. They needed in some ways to be better. And they needed to change to be responsive to what had changed because of COVID. And so that was a really interesting beginning of an insight. On the next slide, let's just talk a little bit about where we are today. I like the quote from Winston Churchill that said that, you know, we're not at the end, we're not at the beginning of the end, maybe, but we're probably at the end of the beginning. And that, I think, sort of sums up a little bit of where we are today. What you can see is we are in the beginning of the reopening. It's different by different geographies. You know, as a global company, Accenture has been studying and paying attention to a lot of the different geos and areas. And you can see that while there's a consistent downturn and upturn, the responses and the results have been very different across these different countries. In fact, we see the different shapes of recovery. And some of you know from reading or watching COVID, the different types of shapes we could have: a V-shaped recovery, or a U-shape, a W-shape, or an L-shape. There you can see in different colors where we think each of those is represented, and a continuing and ongoing challenge. So on the next slide, we talk about not only is the challenge by geography and region, and you can think about how that's happening in Pittsburgh as well. The results and the challenges in Pittsburgh are likely very different than they are for any of those countries I just showed you. But it's also very different, as I say, across industries. And here we just simply split out an analysis of the supply chain complexity with the proportion of jobs that could be performed at home. And what you see is there's a great dispersion and diversity of industry adaptability to the results of COVID. So travel, quite clearly, while it has some ability to perform some number of jobs at home, the vast majority clearly cannot, going all the way to capital markets and insurance. And so why is this slide so important if we think about it? Because one of the things, as I alluded to before, is as you think about your business and you think about the advice that you're getting and the things that you're reading, we think it's really important that you then tailor that to the insights of your industry. Because what's right for travel is not going to be what's right for insurance or banking, et cetera. A couple notes there, you know, job retention schemes, how we manage remote work, et cetera, will all be very different. Next slide. So keeping that in mind, what we also see is a very different perception of the recovery as well as the reality of the recovery. So in July, we tested executives and we asked them in North America, what type of recovery did they expect to see? Most, fortunately, tend to see a U-shaped recovery, particularly strong in things like insurance, as you can see at the top. But you can see the dispersion of the different types of recoveries that are expected by executives in different industries. So airline, travel, and transport clearly, you know, with an almost, but not surprising, 23% thinking it's going to be L-shaped, meaning that they may never recover or will be a very long time before they actually see recovery in that industry. And you can see others are more optimistic. So you can give a quick look to see where your industry falls and see if you agree with that. So on the next slide, leave that up for a second. Good. So in our research, what did we think was really important about responding then to this crisis? We thought there were four things that companies needed to think about, executives needed to think about. The first was outmaneuvering uncertainty. One of the first things we recognized is we tried to create strategies for our clients and for our listeners was the recognition that we couldn't deny the uncertainty and that we should in fact embrace it. So there's good techniques and strategy for times of uncertainty. One of those is scenario-based planning. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So one of the first things we did was integrate scenarios into our thinking, but really embrace the concept of outmaneuvering uncertainty and embracing uncertainty, not denying the uncertainty that exists. The second thing we realized that to reopen was to reinvent, and that we needed to recognize this year of the new normal. So we spent a lot of time thinking about, I'm going to talk to you a bit about what we see are some of the defining characteristics of the new normal, but the recognition that we do have to get to this reinvention. And so on top of everything else, what's difficult, but like I say, what we've seen in a lot of clients is this embrace of a reinvention agenda. So thinking about not just how are we going to respond, but how are we going to reinvent the business to be better positioned when we come out. Now to do that, we're going to need to transform our organizations. So there's an opportunity to build new competencies, digital cost structures, e-commerce, security. Some of those are going to be nice to have, so many of those are going to be imperatives. But we have to think about our transformation agenda and our capabilities and how we're going to get there. One of the things that we saw consistently across a great deal of companies, and it ranged anywhere from 70 to 90% in terms of the answers, but we asked about a lot of different technologies in one of our surveys. And again, companies said that they wished they had accelerated their programs to things like cloud, to security, et cetera, et cetera. So we see a lot of this transformation not being entirely new transformation, but really a function of accelerating the programs that you probably already have in place and the need to do that and how we're going to achieve that. And then the last thing we did as part of our research is we figured out what we think are 5 priorities to commit to reinvention now. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in detail, but we do think that like any kind of challenge, even though there's uncertainty, there's still the deep need for a plan. And we think there's 5 components that we need to think about inside that plan. So on the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about potential scenarios and scenario uncertainty. Some of you may be familiar with scenarios that go back to Royal Dutch Shell and planning for oil futures and that, and the changing nature of geographies of, Saudi Arabia and Russia and all of these things. Royal Dutch Shell wanted to figure out scenarios, but it turns out we can use scenarios for a lot of different kind of strategic questions. And in the COVID example, we figured we asked ourselves, what are the most critical uncertainties? What are the key things we don't know that if we understood and knew them, we would be able to make better strategic decisions? And it turned out that we came up with about 127 of those. And most of them broke down into the 2 big questions that you see here. One is societal response. And in some ways that started out, I confess, as the level of collaboration that we would see between people and government, people and their management. But we expanded that a bit to talk about government, people, and business response. So we said in the total societal response, do we see that as being positive and good and collaborative and useful? Or do we see that devolving into conflict and real challenges? And so some of the things we can look at are, agreement on government laws, regulation, management, agreement on fiscal policy, agreement even on mask wearing and other sort of activities that society is going to be expected to participate in. Then the second dimension was this question of the disease. The uncertainty was we didn't know what was going to happen with the disease, and there's really 2 components to that. One is, will the disease go into remission? Will the disease become worse or better? And then also the question of, will we be able to create responses to it like vaccines, like treatments, et cetera, that would also diminish the effects. So the second big dimension was the question of the disease progression. And it turns out that you can see we get 4 different scenarios that come out of that. Rapid remission, pretty obvious. Flattened curve, the one that we talk a lot about, but we have to be very specific about what that means, which is actually that it doesn't actually go away as much as we sort of hoped for, but that at least societal response is highly effective. The third one is another one that might look familiar depending on your point of view, cyclic outbreaks, which is this idea that both misbehavior, if you want to call it that, from society, as well as a number of other factors, are going to create these cyclic outbreaks. We see some of that already in places like New Zealand reporting new cases. So places that we thought may have avoided it entirely are starting to see new cases. But we also see that happening at the regional and even the city, at communities as small as universities, starting to see that potential of cyclical outbreaks, and then a prolonged wave, which is really just this near chaos. Now, why are these so important? Is because if you think about it, your strategic responses are going to be dependent on whether or not you believe which of these 4 scenarios you believe in. So things like your commitment to inventory, creating inventory, sales, the availability and reliability of supply chains, your human capital strategies and requirements. Are they going to be rapid remission and so a rapid rebound? Are you going to need to bring people on board again quickly? Or is it going to be slower and actually and more punctuated and cyclical? And what is that? What are the implications of that? And we'll see that becomes even more complicated as we think about the natures of our workforce. So on the next slide, let's quickly jump to the question. And what we'd love to see, and I think this will be a really interesting one, is what's the potential scenario do you believe most closely reflects your likely future? I confess we've done this a bunch of times, but I have no idea. I can't predict what this is going to be. Wow. See, I would have predicted a broader dispersion. Oh, there we go. Let's give this just a couple more moments because people might be unfamiliar with the tool and it seems to be still changing a little bit. But I think we're starting to get a bit of our answer here pretty clearly. Nobody thinks this is going away anytime soon. Of course, the going away or what would constitute rapid remission might be a bit of a question of ratios or proportion, but cyclical outbreaks, prolonged wave, clearly we're seeing continued uncertainty, and the kind of things like cyclical outbreaks are going to drive continued uncertainty. And again, so the question is, how does that, and using that as an anchor. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is, I would wonder if you asked your leadership team, and even your employees and managers down to managers, what their answer would be to this. One of the things that we like to do is use this in building consensus for management teams, because what we often find is that management teams have great diversity of opinion about this, and that results in strong differences in opinion of strategic responses. And oftentimes people don't fully understand the differences that they're seeing in their management teams around strategic responses because they don't understand the differences in the underlying beliefs. So one of the tools you can use, and it's available, are the 127, critical uncertainties that we've defined to create these scenarios. But we think it's a really interesting approach to just ask, simply your management teams, this is where it could be going. Where do you think it's going? Next slide, please. So as we continue to see this, we see that there's not necessarily a particularly right answer, which is clear. We said we should talk about that from an industry and regional perspective. But we do see that what is increasingly building up the uncertainty is the uncertainty of where different countries are and where they're headed. And one of the things that affects a lot of our global multinationals, corporations or MNCs, is where are their supply chains, where are their operations, how is that related? So we see that for many multinational corporations, it's not even a question of which are we in, but how do we respond to the fact that we're in multiple scenarios at the same time, all of which are changing. You know, while that's true here, that may also be true even in your regional assessment and your regional operations. It may be different for just different hospitals and different neighborhoods in the city, in the suburbs. All of that may be actually experiencing different scenarios as well, and may require adjustments to strategy. So the next slide. So what do companies need to do? We think there are 5 things that they should think about and do in a particular order as well. The first one that we thought about and recognized in talking to different companies and what they were doing, again, it was always about putting the people first. We need to think about our employees, we need to think about our customers, and any solutions that we define have to be based on that. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that came out of this was the recognition of the need to see the whole employee and to support entire households. And in fact, from a lot of my research experience and thinking about things, you know, you think of the Industrial Revolution and whether or not it's actually over, but historically we bring employees to the workplace and we expect them to kind of forget about everything else. We expect them to dress differently, and we expect them to become part of our machine, part of our operation, our organization. And we kind of expect them to leave their true selves, their real selves at home. And whether or not we say that specifically, it's sort of built into the nature of how we've operated as businesses and societies. And what we see now is really interesting, is the need to see much more of the whole employee. You know, what are the mental health strengths and weaknesses of employees? What are the stresses that they have at home? What are the dependencies? Do they have dependents, both old or young? And then how do we support entire households? The need for children to be in school in order for parents to work, and how that affects different portions of our employees, and how we respond to that. So really it starts with, we think, putting the people first, getting closer to our employees to the extent that they're willing to share and work with us to understand their needs, but it's really about starting at that place. Then once we understand both our customers and our employees a bit better and a bit more personal level, then it's about designing spaces that work. And it's not just about enabling technology, sending people home with computers and that, you know, it's about creating a new remote culture. So how do people communicate even over experiences like this? Does it disadvantage some people who might participate more in person but feel uncomfortable or are left out or marginalized in conversations that happen online? How will we actually foster innovation online? How will we eventually work to create new teams through relationships built online? So there's an awful lot that has to be thought of to the culture that we create in supporting remote work, as well as simply creating the technological solution to that. The third thing is to redesign in phases. And so this was an issue that came up again and again. What we recognized is that the best companies and a lot of the companies we were working with were really looking at it as a multi-stage problem as opposed to a single strategy of what to do next, and recognizing that there were certain priorities to do early, certain financial aspects that had to be managed, and that they really needed a multi-stage solution and that the plan was not a single plan, but was actually a plan for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a year. And so we think that that's in 2 years. And so we think that's the way that companies need to be thinking about their strategy as well, recognizing also the possibility of scenario change. The fourth step was to commit to an elastic cost structure. We saw this again and again. Every company we talked to wished they, whatever extent they were elastic in the sense that they could control their costs and margins, wished that they had a more flexible, dynamic and elastic cost structure. So some of the ways you can do that, simple ways of the technology base, and that's really important too, because while a lot of companies have seen drastic declines in demand, other companies we work with have seen actually dramatic increases. So Carrefour, for example, has seen a tripling of their e-commerce demand. And so scaling that ability has been a real challenge for them. National Health Service in the UK, for example, we worked to, in a matter of, I believe Tawfiq can tell the details, that a week or 10 days, moved 1 million people onto Teams, onto Microsoft Teams. But the kind of systems that you need to support that in an elastic way is really critical. 16 million new viewers on Netflix, essentially almost overnight, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing is getting future ready, which is this idea that we know things are going to be different, but we don't know exactly how. And so this put a lot of stress on companies and their innovation capabilities. A lot of the stuff that we've been working with and talking to folks is how do I actually maintain and in some cases even accelerate my ability to innovate and get future ready. And so we have a bunch of insights about how to listen better to customers. I mean, one of the first things is we're going to have to understand and know what customers want different or want new. And so how are we going to listen to customers? And there's a lot of ways to use technology to get closer to that. Things we were already doing through artificial intelligence, everything from sentiment measuring to data scraping to inference engines, et cetera, using technologies to help us accelerate our learning and listening to our customers. All the way to reinventing the security. If we're going to be online, how are we going to do that? So the next slide. Let's try Menti again and say, what's one of your biggest concerns when thinking about reopening? And let's see what's on your mind right now. People are either shocked and scared or the technology is stressed. Here we go, summer's starting to come. The economy, exposure to COVID, health, here we go. Low demand, capacity restrictions, sustainability. Well, I can say that I think it's really interesting that for everything we talked about, we can see that there's a consistency here around health. And to me, that says a lot about putting our employees and people and our customers first. So I know that some of this is from the fact that we're healthcare industry driven, but I do see from things like employees' health, safety, and all of these other things that there's a tremendous concern in this audience, in this group, about the health and well-being of folks first before even the business needs. Not that those aren't important. You can see costs, profitability, and some of these other things showing up here as well. But it does seem like our five-step approach seems to be pretty consistent with the way that a lot of folks are thinking. Low demand, and some of the other business challenges as well. So we'll leave that a second for people, the spread of disease, and hopefully some of that will come up in the Q&A. So next slide. Certainly COVID and the world hasn't stopped since we did some of our early research. So we've actually done some secondary research that we talked about course corrections. And I just wanted to share some of the things that we've been seeing in some of our most recent research that's been affecting some of our thinking. We call these cross currents, and we think there are three. One is we've been seeing a material shift in people's attitudes. So we've been doing some consistent longitudinal studies of sentiment people. So we do a consumer survey every week and try to understand not just what they're feeling, but how those feelings are shifting over time and get some prediction. And they have been. We understand from economics that consumer behavior is supposed to be based on long-term perceptions of earnings, right? So that people don't stop spending immediately just because they lose a job or because of a downturn. But if they think that's going to have a long-term impact, then behaviors actually start to change. So we're very concerned in trying to keep an eye on whether or not consumers and folks are thinking that this is a short-term adjustment or whether they're seeing this as a long-term adjustment to their lifetime earnings, as economists say, and really a material shift in how they're going to shop forever going forward, or at least in their lifetime. So is this a Depression era shift kind of in behaviors, or is this a 2008 kind of shift? And we're seeing those kind of changes occurring day to day. The second thing that we see is an acceleration in regional divergence and a growing risk of disorder. We saw that in the large number of folks here that responded that they thought the scenario was going to be chaos. It's hard to watch the news and not believe it is going to be chaos. And so we're seeing a lot of that as well, and we're seeing that across the different countries that we're studying and surveying. And so we think that is something to consider going forward. And then a rethinking of fiscal stimulus. The third thing we're seeing is a lot of concern and a lot of shifts in the ways governments are looking to stimulate and maintain economies, both in how they're supporting the unemployed, but also how they're going to be supporting companies and reinvesting and what fiscal policy is going to see. So without going into any detail on that, really what we do see is fundamental shifts in approaches to fiscal policy, and we think that that affects the way that businesses are going to have to think about government support in the economy going forward. As a result, we think there's three things that we recommend doing today to course correct whatever strategies you may have created. One is to be sure to keep human needs at the heart of your choices. So let's not forget about the people clearly. And one of the ways to do that is to embrace some of these new tools for measuring that sentiment, whether it's going out and looking at other companies like Accenture's studies. So our consumer surveys are published in public, looking at some of the other ones of those, but also a function of doing it yourself. Some of these sentiment tools are easy to apply and use even within your own company, and it's a way of gathering that. But in lieu of that, just making sure that your executives are going out and testing for the real needs and sentiments of your people and customers. Second thing is raise global local dexterity. And that global local doesn't even have to mean countries and MNCs. It can mean that even in regions and neighborhoods and operations and locations within your business. So like I say, even inner city versus suburb, different regions, different scale sizes of your operations can have different requirements. And coupled with that is hedging our bets. Now is a good time to be thinking about, even if we have a strategy, what have we done to make sure if things change that we're prepared for the worst. And then reposition for recovery, not relief. We think a lot of the relief kind of measures of government are going away. We think that's affecting a lot of companies that have counted on maintaining their levels of employment, et cetera, from fiscal policy, and really needing to scale to build that financial elasticity going forward based on recovery models of fiscal policy. Next slide. So with that, that's a few of our thoughts from our research of where we've been and where we're going. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions from yourselves.
Okay,
Hey,
so
Patrice.
good morning, Paul, Tafiq. I wanted to just start off with Q&A with one of the top question would be just how are companies adjusting decision-making processes to account for the ongoing uncertainties presented by COVID-19?
Yeah, I can probably get us started on that one. This is actually, it's a big challenge. And as you saw from the data that was shown, and hopefully, I can't wait to hear some of your questions, by the way, but this is, there's a lot of difficulty in terms of determining what to do next. There's a lot of uncertainty, as you all said, and there's a lot of challenges that people are worried about for the future, not just about their health, but how are you gonna operate as a business in the future? So to your question, companies, based on all this research that Paul shared, companies are really struggling with determining what it is they're gonna be versus what they are doing today. And it's pretty clear from the responses that we got, what you see that your future looks like is different than what your current present situation is. And so a lot of companies, especially many of you who are maybe on the phone right now, you're dealing with a more virtual business. If you're in healthcare, now you're seeing your patients with telehealth. If you're doing work in retail setting, people are buying things online only. They're not really showing up to the store anymore. And the question is, are these kind of changes, are they going to continue on in the future? And really the answer is yes. There's going to be a shift in the way that customers go after the products they have. It's the shift in the way that patients interact with their doctors and other people in the hospital. There's a shift in the way that we do our work. Is even like, I noticed there's a lot of engineers on the call. There's some shifts in the way that you do your work, because as you all know, as engineers, it's one of those where you're used to maybe working in a team room, and now you're working virtually and you're learning how to collaborate more in a virtual setting. So it's definitely a shift in how companies work. And at the same time, I'd love to hear from you as you have questions. It's a shift in terms of the actual process. So I'm happy to share some examples, if that's what you'd like to hear too, of what some companies are doing differently now that we're shifting to a slightly different environment, and what they're going to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that, because I like the, the question of, it sort of comes to me in terms of governance. And what we saw was something really interesting that was counterintuitive to me, and that's why I wanted to share that. Was we tried to say that we should decentralize decision making, because it's very hard to say that what's right for one location, what's right for one operation is not right for the other. But one of the things we actually heard from companies themselves was that the question was not how to decentralize decision making, but how to centralize it. Because in fact, now is the time that you have to make sure that everybody's on board with the right regulations, and making sure that even if something might be acceptable in one location, you may want to follow a broader standard, a more rigorous standard from a global perspective. And by global, I just mean company-wide and organization-wide perspective. So we think that it's really a function of making sure that management is staying very close to all of its leadership, is sussing out, is raising up what are the questions about local things. I mean, some of the examples I can give you are things like, to what extent do we have to do temperature testing and cleaning standards of this and that? Every geography, every city, every town can have a different standard to that. But as we operate as businesses across that, we have to make a determination: are we going to localize those decisions or centralize certain ones? And so we want to be very focused on what matters corporate-wide or central-wide, what will not be, what has to be in place, as well as how do we let local managers make decisions that can be more effective for their local operations.
I think another question that that just came in, and it could lead into what you were just talking about, is how are companies looking to lead in this time of crisis? So I think an example, Tawfiq or Paul, like you were like dance around. Maybe we could jump into that.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So first, let me say this, because there are some things that we've seen because we work with a lot of these companies. There's characteristics we see from what we call leading companies. So everyone always asks, like, what do you see as a company who's going to succeed in the midst of COVID? But then what's a company that's going to come out of this stronger than they came in? And that's really an important question. So I think starting from there and then giving you some examples, there's actually a lot of correlation with the way that we see succeeding companies now with some of the advice that we've been giving companies just in standard time. So in one way, COVID has really jump-started what we've seen in terms of a transition to a new digital transformed workplace, a new digital environment, and a new digital business. So a lot of you on the phone, your companies have already had pressure in the past several years to move to a more digital existence, right? So it's maybe upgrading the systems you have, working more collaboratively virtually, preparing your environment and systems in a way to have this resilience. So if anything goes wrong for whatever reason, you're prepared in case something happens. So a lot of the investments that companies have made just to improve their infrastructure, improve the way their their teams work together, improve the work environment and the company culture. I like to say it this way, there's a kind of a culture of care. If your company has already implemented a culture of care in place and has that in place to start with, you've come out of this a lot better than companies that didn't necessarily have that, because you're able to check on your other employees. So, and I'll give you a real world example. So there's one of these companies that we've been working with. They have employees all around the country, as in both call centers, in their offices and other places. And they've invested a lot of time and energy this period into building these employee resource groups. And these groups have served to help keep all of their employees, the best way of saying it is watching out for their employees' like own personal and mental health, because it's one of those where, look, we're a lot of us, we're all stuck behind a computer screen a lot of the day. We're on phone calls. We're missing out on the same social interaction that we've had. So being able to have some of that with your coworkers is important, but honestly, having people check on you is even more important. And then on the flip side, it's the same with your customer base. I mean, the people that you work with, the people you interact with, whether you're selling things as a retail store or you're interacting with people more on like let's say an insurance company interacting with one of your policyholders, or a physician interacting with your patients, you just have this additional sense of interaction that needs to take place. So seeing companies invest more money on that customer relation side has been a big thing, but having the tools and capabilities in place to interact with people in a virtual setting is key really to success. It was key to success in the past, but really, if anything, it's been jump-started by the challenges that everyone's facing today. And that's something that we don't see is going to let up at all. So the companies that will be successful coming out of here are the ones who have really transformed their business to be a successful digital business.
Yeah, just a couple things I would add to that before we go to the next question. I think one of the things that's interesting is how we talk about 3 months and 3 weeks and 3 years and 3 months. A lot of companies have been taking the lead, really, fortunately, only by having to accelerate what they were doing anyway. So a lot of companies have seen that they're what we call in previous work the inevitable future. Remote work, telehealth, some of these other things were actually things that we were heading to anyway. We've just had to get there a lot faster. So we see a lot of leading companies, what they're doing is working on their agility, working on their speed, their process and change speed, but really, fortunately, really only going in the same direction. And so that can be a very positive, one good point of minimizing the challenges. Just accelerate, don't, it may not be entirely a reinvention agenda.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point, Paul, because it actually shifts. So even now the challenge for companies is if they don't continually reinvent, they get stuck. Like we have a client that we're working with in the media space, and they invested a whole lot of money and energy recently in releasing in the last few months really a digital streaming platform, kind of like it's a Netflix competitor. So they released this digital streaming platform. It had a great pickup up front. And then now they're getting to a point where like a lot of media companies, how are we going to create new content? They've already watched all the new shows we have. They've watched all the things there. How are we going to produce content now that we can't get them to show up on set to film because of the virus, right? And the pandemic. So it's actually fascinating that even you have to continually reinvent. It's not just you do one thing and it's like, wow, we came up with something new and it worked. Because if you don't continue, you're kind of, now what's next? So
Yeah.
definitely
Let me build on that just for a moment, because we have some actual real research that we're conducting right now off of the 2008 and previous downturns. And we think there's really sort of three categories of response and innovation. So you can start new businesses that are directly responsive to the downturn's problems. You can invent or reinvent or start new businesses for the longer term. And you can invent for the short term, but then transition that to the longer term. And what we're actually finding is the most successful companies are the ones that either started businesses with a longer term vision or started businesses with the short term vision, but understood how they were going to transition that. Because what happens a lot of times, to Taufik's point, is you say, well, content's going to be a great business. Now I move into it, but I realize I don't really have the capabilities to doing that, to make the content. It's a lot more costly than I thought. Then when the demand goes away from, when circumstances change again, all of a sudden you don't really have a viable business there. Mm-hmm. So in fact, actually the literature, the research we're doing now sort of suggests, believe it or not, be a little careful about being too quick to respond directly to the opportunities of the downturn, because unless you're prepared to transition that, make that part of your broader business, I guess you would call it could be a flash in the pan, kind of problem. And so I think in terms of healthcare and some of the other ones, if you think about some of the temporary solutions you might create, even in telehealth, well, is that going to be something you transition to a longer, more omni-channel delivery and solution for health? Yeah. Or is that really something where you're just going to be keeping people, handling people that are not going into the office or into the doctor's office right now, but in 6 months, a year, 2 years are actually going to go right back to the old way and potentially cost you your investment in that new approach. So we have to be careful.
And Taufik, could you just possibly give us some more client examples off of that, off of what Paul just talked about?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm happy to. And I think also like building on some of the things I said. So just one of the ones that Paul had mentioned earlier, and you asked me to say more about it now, was around a healthcare example. So as many of you know from hospital systems and people in healthcare, it's actually very, very slow to get technology moving, right? It's very slow to get new technologies implemented. And there's a lot of extra safety that you have to go through in part of healthcare. And give me an example of someone that we worked with. So I can name these folks. So many of you are familiar with the National Health Service out in the UK. So we had an awesome opportunity of working with them a few months ago, and we worked with them over the course of, I think it was only a few weeks, like 3 or 4 weeks, and we transitioned all of their workforce. So we're talking about over 1 million people. We transitioned everyone who works with the NHS to using Microsoft Teams and using a digital work environment. Now, that's a project that they've been going through for a very long time. So one of the fascinating things that we've seen is that the red tape and the challenges that you face right now, the companies and the organizations that are successful in transitioning are the ones who find ways and work together. And it's actually fascinating. In a way, it takes these decisions that were made in one part and then sent to a different part of the company to get approval, and sent to a different part of the company to get another set of approval. It brings all the leadership team together, and having the leadership team of these companies together to make big decisions that impact all of the employees at once, and frankly, take a bigger risk, because these are risks that in the past, the cost benefit of the risk wasn't worth it, but now they become more worth it. And another example to share is there's a company that we worked with in the more of the resources energy space. And as you know, in the energy space, there's a lot of the price of oil, the price of energy has gone down a lot. So some companies, we've actually helped one of these companies find a way to take all of their tankers. So they have all these tankers that are sitting there with empty capacity. And as many of you know, if you have empty capacity with your tankers, what are you going to do with it? And they found a way, and we helped them out to basically find a way to rent those out. So they actually have a way that they can rent it to be used for other things. Let's say taking medical supplies from one part of the world to another part of the world, instead of just having them sit there empty, or honestly, in some cases, make less money by filling them up with what they're traditionally meant to be used for. But that's a risk because it takes away from what the bottom line is for the company in case something goes up. So everyone has these trade-offs to make, and it really comes down to what kind of challenges you take. And honestly, right now, sometimes it can turn out really, really well for companies to take these risks, and other times maybe not. But this is just a situation where the risks that you may not have made in the past are worth making now. So, and I'd love to hear if there's more questions too from the audience coming in.
One would be, how have customers and employees engagement impacted companies' efforts to navigate to the new normal?
A good question. So it's definitely, it's dependent on the company. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the engagement efforts. It really comes from the top, and it's having, so first off, what we found is like very effective is just the leadership of a company explaining to all of their employees, and in some parts their customers too, but you're really explaining what's happening. I think it's important to have a realization that this is a challenging time. This is not an easy time for companies. You're having to make tough decisions. The revenue's down. You may have to make layoffs. You may have to change the way that you work. You may have to rethink what certain departments do, and maybe ask a group of folks to retrain in doing something else so then they can be successful in a different thing. But the exciting part about the situation is if you frame it from that way, you can really build your employee trust, because you're going to need it to think about what you're going to do in the future, especially if what you're doing is going to change. And I'd say this from an employee perspective, change is hard. I mean, I've had to deal with this as an employee at Accenture here. Like, change is hard. We're going through changes ourselves, and we have different things that we're struggling with. But at the same time, as a company, it's an opportunity for where you're going to end up. And right now, I think the best way of considering, and I tell all the people who I work with, consider the changes that you have to do and the work you have to do to get there as an investment in your future and then in your company's future, because you can come out of this stronger or better at a certain thing, or you can actually like go like beyond your comfort zone, do something different, do something that's exciting, something new. I mean, that's really what we're all about here, at least here in America where we are. And I remember in Pittsburgh, it's a big part of what the city's about, right? So all of the companies and people out there, think about what it is you can do that's a little bit different, and invest in those new capabilities and new things that will help you to grow in the next 5 to 10 years, not just help you recover in the next 5 to 10 months.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Tawfik. I mean, what occurs to me is that even for myself, I know that people are tired. People are right? Folks, we're coming into a different phase, clearly, because, you know, what people can tolerate for a few months or even 6 months may not be what they can tolerate for a year or 5 years. So I think as we think about this going forward, to Tawfik's point about, you know, we got to start to focus on the new. We got to start to focus on how we have some fun, how we team and enjoy, and how we don't expect, and I think it's really key, and we're looking at this a lot, how we don't expect people who've done incredible things in the past 3 to 5 months to have to sustain that forever, and recognizing that, you know, what we've been able to do for now may not be what we can ask of people going forward. So we're going to have to change. And to Tawfik's point, I think, you know, counting on the robustness and vibrance of various cities, you know, like Pittsburgh, and organizations like this that help companies work together to say, hey, you know, it's tough, but we're going to get through this, is how we're going to do it.
Well, thank you both for you know, attending and answering the Q&A. I'm going to quickly pass it over to Sarah Gale to do our closing for the webinar. But again, thank you very much. It was very interesting and great research and information.
Thanks, Patrice.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Patrice. And thank you to all of the Allegheny Conference's regional investors who were able to participate in today's webinar. A most sincere thank you to our member Accenture for presenting today. We hope that you find programs like these helpful and informative. A big thanks to Paul Nunes, Global Managing Director of Thought Leadership for Accenture Research, and Tawfik Jarjour, Senior Manager, Accenture Strategy, for presenting today's program. Last but not least, A thanks again to our sponsors, Peoples, Giant Eagle, Highmark, and UPMC Health Plan for their support, which allows us to offer this critical programming. Remember that the Allegheny Conference has launched a COVID-19 response website, including our Ready Pittsburgh Reopening Toolbox, which we hope serves as a resource for you as our region continues with a safe and sustained recovery. You can find a link to it at the top of our homepage at alleghenyconference.org. Thanks again, and hope you have a great rest of your day.